All right, so I'm here with Keith Woods again. We have been going back and forth with an interesting exchange on the multiverse, God, the problem of fine-tuning in physics, and there are a lot of issues that are kind of tangentially related. I'm not sure how much we'll get into, but first of all, Keith, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing pretty well. Should be an interesting discussion. I always learn something when we talk.
Yeah, likewise. So to give a basic recap, Keith, you put out a video a week ago or so where you discussed the problem of fine tuning and the possible solution of the multiverse to that problem. Fine tuning, for those that don't know, is the problem in physics where the physical constants have very particular values. If you changed, say, the gravitational constant just a little bit, planets wouldn't form, stars wouldn't form, life would not be possible. So the vast majority of possible settings for the physical constants do not facilitate life, and yet we find ourselves in a universe with life. So two popular solutions are the argument from design. So there is a creator or engineer fine-tuning the universe to harbor life, or on the other hand, all possible values of the constants exist out there somewhere, and of course we would find ourselves in one of those universes that can harbor life. So that's the classic kind of many worlds or multiverse response to fine tuning. That is actually the one that I went for back in college when I was looking at Christian versus atheist debates. I recognized that fine tuning was a legitimate problem for an atheist unless you went for the multiverse. And I had already bought into the many worlds interpretation just kind of for purely physics-based reasons, and so that was a natural fit. And then for me, looking into multiverse theories and thinking about kind of logical consequences of them, I ended up coming back to a theist or panentheist position after a while. So this argument has a special place in my heart. It's been important for my upbringing. So I'm glad that Keith raised the topic of fine tuning. But let's just kind of start from the beginning. Keith, you did not like the many worlds response to fine tuning for a number of reasons, and we've already gone back and forth in responses. But why don't you just kind of, for the audience, reiterate what are your basic intentions with the many worlds or multiverse response to fine tuning?
All right. Well, my main point against multiverse as an explanation is that it doesn't really explain fine tuning. I think it takes away the quantitative element, and that okay, we don't have these very specific measures like the gravitational constant, the cosmological constant, because you have every possible universe within whatever parameters of possibility this multiverse entails. But you still have the issue of you have a multiverse generator, or you have you have something that contains these universes, which in itself then has to be fine-tuned to produce universes that are fine-tuned for life. So although it takes away like the kind of quantitative element and takes away some of the specific constants that people point to argue for design, I think it kind of just pushes the question back a bit. Some of my criticisms, like some of the things you might expect in, say, an average universe in a multiverse that you'd expect, chaos to rise, or maybe the laws of physics work to a certain point and then stop working, or planets appear and disappear. I think the mathematical universe hypothesis that you brought up deals with that to an extent, but I still think there's an element of it that it doesn't deal with. Like in your response, your last response, you said, so I said, well, if there's every mathematically possible universe, right, there's universes where Erval wins the lottery 20 times in a row. And you said, yeah, it would happen, but you wouldn't expect it to happen because it's such a low probability event. But it still seems like to me that it kind of complicates the issue of talking about probability, because, it's low probability, but every mathematically possible universe exists. So, isn't it it seems just as likely there'd be a universe where you win the lottery 20 times in a row as you win it once, right? So there's all these sort of extremely unlikely events that have to be fulfilled in a universe. So it seems like if you're in an average universe, you'd expect to encounter some of these extremely unlikely events or some collection of them. Like, I don't know, it seems like when you start talking about like infinities or every possible mathematical universe, couldn't you say that there would be as many universes where you win the lottery 20 times as you win it once? So, I don't know, talk about like an average universe or what we might expect seems to make that question a bit confused, I think. So that's one thing I'd be interested in hearing your response to.
Yeah. So if there is a universe out there that harbors this improbable event, it can still be the case that there are less instantiations of that low probability event than there are instantiations of the high probability events that you see every day. So for me, this works very naturally with our meaning of probability because let's say if an event has 50% chance of happening, what you're saying is that 50% of future timelines from your perspective contain that event. Whereas if you don't actually have those counterfactual worlds as real things, then what actually is probability even pointing to? The ontology of statistics is simplified in a way with a many worlds account. So if something is low probability, that means that of all of the possible future timelines in front of you, very few of those branches equate to that low probability event. Many more equate to a high probability event. What do you think of that?
Yeah, but if we're looking at it like, say, Jesus language, like prior to any universe, then shouldn't there be a mathematically possible universe where you win the lottery 500 times in a row? Like there's these single events of just such, insane improbability, but they have to be instantiated in some universe. It's impossible to put like some kind of quantitative element to this, but it seems like we'd expect very unlikely events to happen in an average universe, whereas probability seems to be quite uniform in this universe, right?
I guess I'm not really seeing the step where you say we would expect it to happen in ours. If one out of every trillion universes contains Airval winning the lottery 500 times, then, I mean, you have a one out of a trillion chance of encountering that.
But
Um,
if it's every mathematically possible universe, like say in this universe, there's a 1 in a trillion chance of that happening to you. But if every mathematically possible universe is instantiated, would we say that out of a trillion universes, you'd only expect to see an event like that in one?
Right. Yeah, that's how the many worlds interpretation makes sense of probability. It's because you're saying one out of these trillion universes contains this event, and that's why it's a 1 in a trillion chance.
Yeah, I mean, that seems like an incongruence to me. It seems like every possible universe where this 1 in a trillion event happens has to be instantiated, but it seems like maybe this sounds illogical, but it seems like that would be more than 1 in a trillion universes because the only issue is possibility, but that possibility can exist alongside like almost every other possible universe, if you understand what I mean.
It necessitates that improbable events would occur in this scope of multiverse, but it does not necessitate that you would find yourself. I mean, think about probability like a jar full of beans, right? You have like 1,000 red beans, and you only have one blue bean in this jar. You reach in, what's the chance that you're going to pull out that blue bean, this improbable event? Well, it's like 1 in 1,001, right? So if there's one universe out of a trillion where this highly improbable event occurs, then it's really just an exact analogy to having the jar of beans, and there's the one improbable one that sometimes you will get it, but you wouldn't expect to get it on any one given act of measurement, act of observation. So there's no reason why our observation, our measurement should skew towards the improbable event, even if it's there in the jar, you know?
But it seems like, okay, so every possible universe that has, humans that has an Airval, it seems like, if you've every mathematically possible universe. Okay, so we've universe A, which is like this one, and then we've universe B, where it's like this one, but it rains on October 20th, 2020, instead of it being sunny, it rains in Italy or something. But it seems like to both of those, you can add the possibility, the actuality in this case, of you winning the lottery 20 times in a row. So if you're looking at it from outside, I don't know, can you just apply like regular probability where you're like, well, it's 1 in a trillion event in our universe, so 1 in a trillion universes would have this.
Yeah.
Because if every mathematically possible universe is instantiated, then each time you have a universe like this, you have to have another mathematically possible universe that's exactly the same, except you win the lottery 20 times in a row. See what I mean?
Okay. Well, I don't necessarily agree that any state, any causal configuration of the universe at any given point in time can automatically be adjoined to Erval winning the lottery 500 times. Like, there are a lot of contingent circumstances that would have to be in place, and that would narrow down the universes. You're not any old universe. You can just append like Erval wins the lottery 500 times. I would say that's not mathematically consistent because I have to enter the lottery 500 separate times. I have to like have psychological characteristics that would lead me to do that. So I don't think this quite works to kind of destroy the probability argument.
Maybe I can think of a better example. I mean, it just seems like if we're talking about infinite possibilities, yeah, it seems like that would skew the probability of extremely unlikely things happening, because again, they have to happen infinite many times within what's possible. But I mean, what's mathematically possible is pretty broad, right?
Right. But then even if it happens an infinite number of times, it can be a smaller infinity and you can still make those probability estimates. You know, you can have an infinity whose velocity is 1/1 trillionth of the infinity of like the instantiations of a more commonplace universe. So just because something happens infinitely many times does not mean that like obliterates the probability estimate. I think the way to make sense of probability in general is actually to invoke the idea of many worlds and branching timelines. Otherwise, what are we even saying with probability estimates when we say there's a 30% chance? Like, I honestly don't understand, unless there are branching timelines, what that even means, you know? Like, it may work predictively, but what is the ontology underlying probability estimates? What are we saying about the world when we say this has a 30% chance of happening? Unless we're saying 30% of the timelines in front of us contain this event.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's kind of related to a similar objection I had, which is, so if mathematical universe hypothesis is true, and we're still talking about an average universe, it seems far more likely that you'd be in a universe with a small pocket of order rather than a universe that's ordered throughout. Now, you said the anthropic principle beats that because, well, the universe has to be ordered for life to evolve for you to observe that. But why couldn't it be a small pocket of order? Why couldn't we have that level of order in the pocket of the universe we inhabit? And then you could have evolution and you could have people emerge to observe it. But it doesn't seem to follow that the entire universe has to be as ordered as it is. That's an objection Robin Collins makes as well. He says, he uses the example of like, if you shake a Scrabble board, you might expect it to make one word, but for the entire thing to align is obviously a much lower probability. So again, if we're talking about an average universe, wouldn't you expect more universes with small pockets of order than a universe ordered throughout?
Again, I don't quite understand what it would mean to say that we have a small pocket of order here, as in like the laws of physics hold here, and then like we go out beyond the edge of the solar system and the laws of physics no longer hold, or there are different laws of physics. Is that the idea?
Well, if it's every mathematically possible universe, I mean, couldn't you have a law-like but still chaotic universe? If it's mathematically possible universes, wouldn't you have every like instantiation of every possible like four-dimensional configuration of mass energy?
Right. Yeah. If it was like literally any mathematically possible universe, that would be the case. But the anthropic principles and explanation there is that you would need a cosmos that is ordered enough for billions of years. And it would need to be ordered within a certain kind of space where none of those chaotic events would impinge upon the order of that pocket. Like, we may well be in a pocket of order with the observable universe, and maybe the laws of physics kind of get fuzzy and change beyond a certain point, for all we know. Like, we could be in that kind of pocket of order, but it's just a very big pocket. I think in order to have stability for 4 billion years, you're going to have a very large pocket so that no chaotic stuff can impinge upon the solar system and disrupt the evolution of life. So I don't know. I think you would expect to find yourself in a big pocket of order. There may well be more chaotic parts of the universe out there. The other part of this is that if the laws of physics are different in different places, they still will have to have some kind of underlying deeper set of laws shared in common. Otherwise, the idea of their like inhabiting the same larger space no longer makes sense. Like an object inhabiting space is part of the laws of physics. And insofar as we can be said to cohabit the universe in general with chaotic portions of the universe, it's not going to be totally different, radically different from the laws that obtain here. There could be variations, but I think the anthropic principle would limit those variations to being far enough away that we wouldn't have observational access to them. And then they would be laws that persist and don't change for a long enough period of time. So that's with math alone as the guiding principle of which universes actually form. But I did bring in this idea that I think mathematical entities, coherent mathematical entities, are also integrated information systems and therefore minds. And so the evolution of the cosmos does proceed according to some teleological principles as well. That's my view. That's Chris Langen's view. That's Leibniz's view. I think there is something to that, but that's not the same as a single creator fine-tuning the physical constants to one single space-time dimension. You can still have many branching timelines, each of which is shaped by teleological principles at all points. So then you might not expect this chaotic stuff to obtain in the majority of configurations if that is antithetical to teleological principles. So that's one other way to respond to that objection.
So part of your view is you think that all mathematical objects are minds in some sense, like something like a monad?
Right. If it exists by itself, it has to be self-defining. It has to contain its own essence. That's the idea of an ousia in Greek metaphysics. So if you don't have that integrating factor of a given mathematical set, then there's no guarantee that you're talking about a genuine set. The analogy I used was like a bad sculptor who throws a bunch of stuff together and calls it a work of art. Well, is it really one thing that you're talking about if there's no internal unity? Like, what are the valid sets of things in reality? For something to be a set standing independent of my making it a set with my mind, it has to have a capacity for self-definition. And why I point to an integrated information system is that all of the parts of the integrated information system communicate with all of the other parts. And so if that's what mathematical entities have to be independent of us, to be independent of other observers, they have to have this internal integration themselves, then the way that those systems evolve could plausibly be said to be teleologically directed if we go with integrated information theory and say that integrated information systems are minds.
Another issue with this, like, what is God in this system then? Because it seems like you're denying that there's anything simple or non-composite, that you have these kind of self-subsistent minds, but it seems like when you're describing your system that God is almost kind of an accidental effect of it, or even in the fact that he has to perceive all of these possible existent worlds, that he doesn't have power to differentiate between existence and non-existence. Like, it's at that point, like, what even is God? Because he doesn't have causal power. He's not simple. There isn't anything like simple or non-composite in this system.
No, yeah. When I mentioned integrated information systems, those are minds in the context of mathematical entities. So I was using that concept to limit the kinds of universes that you would get from Tegmark's mathematical universe hypothesis. But I also think there are hypercosmic minds, pure intellects, rather than minds that are process-oriented. Integrated information systems, you can't define one unless you're talking about a number of states that a system can take on. So that would be like in the realm of soul. in the Platonic hierarchy. I think there would also be intellects above that that have a deeper kind of integration, not where all of the parts communicate with each other through dianoia, through thinking, but through noesis, right? Direct intuition of their own essence, which is outside of time. So those would be hypercosmic beings. Intellectual essences aren't anywhere in the cosmos. Those do shape the cosmos, though, in that those structures are what the souls, integrated information systems, have access to. That's what they're made of, to then go on and produce their own creative products. So it's not like the forms are inert, and it's not like only integrated information systems shape the direction of things. The actual possible forms above mathematics, strictly speaking, above soul, strictly speaking, also play a role. And then, above the intellect, there is the one, pure simplicity, pure divinity, that is equally present absolutely everywhere, is ubiquitous, is the unity that allows any other integrated system to come together. So like integrated information systems would be impossible without the one underlying multiplicity at the end of the day, right? So that God, in my conception, the primal God, is simple and is basically what Plato describes as the one. So there is still a place for God. When I limit mathematical systems to being directed by teleological behavior, that's not exhaustive of everything in the metaphysics I'm describing. That's just how the cosmos itself would be shaped.
All right, yeah, so it's a very it's like a Pythagorean idealism. Like God isn't really a creative force in this, right? Like to me, it kind of seems to limit God a lot. If you're like your point about there couldn't be a difference between existent universes and possible universes, because if God can like conceive of them, then that means they exist. But that seems like a massive limitation on God, actually, and also seems to make it seems to make all those universes actually just part of God. Like they kind of they have necessary existence, and also by being perceived by God, they're an extension of God, right? Because there's no difference between God's conceiving of them and their existing. So all of these multiple universes exist, and they're like parts of God, and they exist necessarily. It's almost like God is being made like it's almost like he's a contingent being, but he's like an absolute contingent being. It's like an absolute, like the mass of contingencies combined is God.
Right.
It seems like quite a limitation on God, if anything.
There are other limitations that people could put on God, for instance, like, oh, can God do something irrational? Can God contradict his own attributes? Is God confined to his own attributes? All of those are supposed limitations on God. And I think the reason why we think of those as limitations is that we're not understanding the idea of divine simplicity deeply enough, I guess. Like God's freedom is to be what he is. He doesn't have like the freedom that we seem to have to decide to do different things at different moments because he's eternal. So there's no time in which God takes particular acts. The essence of God is outside of time. And if he's eternal, then in a way, everything that flows out of him is necessary. All of his acts are necessary. And if we take divine simplicity, then all of his attributes, properties, and acts blend together such that God's act of creation is his act of omniscience, is his act of omnipotence, is his act of omnibenevolence. So because all of those inhere together in God with divine simplicity, there isn't room for God to like know certain things with his omniscience, but then to create different things, because God's omniscience is his creation. That's not the way Catholics would think about it, but I think ultimately the Catholic position is incoherent because of that. That's the same critique that J. Dyer makes. Like if you take divine simplicity far enough, you get to Advaita Vedanta, and J. Dyer recognizes that. I think that's ultimately true. And if you don't take divine simplicity, then you're going to have other theological problems. Like this all does ultimately orbit around theology. The many worlds problem brought me back to considerations of theology after a few years of thinking about it. And so I do think it's deeply related, but if we can, I want to kind of back off the strictly theological points and try to address the rest of the like multiverse aspects of this. But the problem is, if you want to posit a God, a particular theology that has alternative characteristics, fine, but where are we deriving that concept of God from? And like, there's a lot of theological work that we're going to have to do to decide, like, okay, what is the true nature of God? If we say that he is not divinely simple and outside of time, and all of his acts, his creations necessarily flow from him, if we want to preserve his ability to act without necessity, then like, why are we going to argue that? And what's the alternative concept of God that we're going to land on? We could take that road, but that would just go into straight up theology discussing the nature of God. And, I don't know all of your thoughts on that. I'd be interested to hear them. But if we can, if you don't mind, I'd like to go back first, just to this initial objection, because I didn't respond to it in our talk yet. The multiverse generator, you say, is just kind of pushing back the problem of fine tuning. But like, if the laws of the universe generator are just the laws of physics, but instead of physical constants with numerical values, they too are variables, and they're instantiated in all of their possible variations, then we have eliminated the problem of fine tuning, strictly speaking. So we're not pushing back the problem if we just say that the universe generator is all of the known laws of physics, so nothing extra there, but the physical constants don't take specific values, they take variable values, and it's the anthropic principle that sets us in one that's hospitable to life. So to me, that does address fine tuning, even though that's not strictly how I think it works.
I agree with that. The video I did responding to you, I said that the mathematical universe hypothesis does clean up that problem of like having these relations between multiverse generator and laws within universes and laws beneath universes.
It does solve fine tuning itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I moved to the arguments about like what would an average universe be then if you were in the mathematical universe hypothesis. And the other argument was, can we go as far as saying that mathematical objects have causal power? Like, that seems like a big leap to me. I know he's basically doing it on the basis of parsimony. I said it was something like a bait and switch, and you said, well, anything on top of maths doesn't provide additional explanatory power. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to formulate what exactly the problem with this is, but I mean, intuitively, it seems like, what's the difference between imagined and real entities? Or why do we even experience change, right? If all of these mathematical objects are instantiated for all time, yeah, you get this kind of like Pythagorean idealism. But I mean, we imagine objects all the time that don't have existence, or there's a difference between those and what does exist. So I mean, you can say it doesn't add anything on top of the math in terms of an explanation to make a distinction between existence and non-existence, but it still seems like something that's necessary.
Yeah, those are two separate objections that we were dealing with before. One is this problem of imaginary substances and what their ontological place would be and how that would apply to God. And I want to discuss that in just a moment. But first, the bait and switch. So if you want to say that what makes something real is something additional to the mathematical properties, and I'm defining math as basically just relations between abstract relata. The symbols that we use to indicate those relata, the abstract objects in their systems of relation, are arbitrary and could take on any number of values. Like, I can think of qualia in terms of abstract objects in a way. Like the qualia red is relativistically defined. It takes its value relative to the other aspects of the electromagnetic spectrum and the way they hit our sense organs. And there's experimental data backing that up, where if you put people in rose-colored sunglasses for like a week, their brain will actually kind of reset the standard of color so that while they're wearing the glasses, everything looks like it did before, like the normal color spectrum. And then when they finally take the glasses off, because their brain is adjusted to the new norm, then all of a sudden everything looks blue shifted. I think that's roughly how it works. So that would indicate then that like qualia have a similar nature to abstract relata in mathematical systems. So that this is a very powerful way of accounting for things ontologically, to define them relative to each other. And then if something has to have an absolute scalar property, then we have numbers handily enough. And if we want to do anything additional on top of that, to say that's the real physical stuff, we're going to have to define that and say what that is. So like it seems weird to just, get rid of the physicalness and keep the math, but it's the math is doing all the work in actually explaining the physical behavior of systems. So what, in addition to math, are we going, would you agree that if we don't have anything additional, anything specific to add on top of pure mathematics, then like there isn't a justification for separating like the essence of physical systems from those purely mathematical elements?
Well, again, I mean, just with direct experience, I mean, things come in and out of existence, right? So what is the maths telling us about the difference between existent and non-existent things here?
Well, we perceive things at certain times and then cease to perceive them, but you could mathematically describe a system with many states. And that whole system with all of its states could exist in a computer simultaneously. And then you, as a user of the computer, could go in and navigate between the different states in that system. And to you, like it's similar to reading through a book. As you're reading along with the plot, it seems like this character died. But did he really? Like the character has an eternal existence. The mathematical structure has an eternal existence. And because we are progressing through that structure, things seem to change, but that is our motion relative to a stable system ultimately. So that's the B theory of time or C theory. But
yeah, so you're imagining like this block universe where it's like everything, right. All these mathematical structures are like on a disk, and when it's projected, when we're inside it, we have the illusion of change, but really it exists as like an abstract object like data. But then are you adding like an extra element where there's like souls like inhabiting this block universe that are like making a progression through this pre-established system? Is that like an extra element then? Like do souls have like a level of freedom within this block universe?
Yeah, because I would say souls are not strictly defined relative to their substrates. This goes back, if the essence of the soul is mathematical, if minds are integrated information systems, then they are substrate independent because it's the existence of the network of nodes that matters, not some underlying matter. So when we're talking about the database, the block time universe in which souls exist, it's not numerically one. There isn't numerically one substrate system that souls are moving around in, because the souls are simpler than the rest of the universe all taken together. There is ambiguity as to where exactly they fall in the system. Just like if you wanted to identify an electron and where the electron exists in reality, well, electrons are completely identical to one another, and there's no difference between two electrons. So if you ask, like, where is the electron? Well, it's everywhere electricity is. It's everywhere atoms are, right? So in a similar way, then, this is my own peculiar move in philosophy. I have not actually seen anyone else do a similar thing, but the idea is that because there's ambiguity about what kind of substrate cosmos a soul exists within, the soul exists relative to a superposition of possible substrates. And that gives you this branching timeline where with measurement, you narrow down the set of possible substrate universes. There's also, at the same time, standard quantum mechanics says this, a loss of information about the past as you specify future states. Otherwise, with every measurement, you would create more and more specification and therefore increase the amount of information in the universe. And that's impossible because conservation of information also holds along with mass energy. So what I'm getting at is souls, because of their ambiguity, because they're finite, they have many possible underlying worlds that they could be said to exist within. And any given act of measurement, that act of measurement determines which universe the soul is in at that moment. Henry Stapp, in his book Quantum Theory and Free Will, describes the von Neumann formalism of quantum mechanics, where basically, like, what determines the outcome of measurement is a query on the part of the observer, and that query is somehow made outside of time. That's what Henry Stapp says. And that is similar to Schopenhauer's idea of our free will, where we don't have free will in time for Schopenhauer because of causal determinacy, but we do have a kind of freedom to be what we are. And so our act of will in this is the act of measurement itself. And so every time we measure something, anytime our attention is drawn to something and we create a specification out of what was formerly a superposition, we are willing to be exactly that. And in a sense, the motion between different moments of observation is illusory. What's real is your will to observe what you are currently observing, and that's your freedom to be what you are. So it's kind of complicated, but I don't know if that helps at all with the problem we were trying to address there.
Well, I'm very skeptical about like quantum physics defending free will, because it always seems like with these arguments that all it does is add an element of indeterminacy that could be translated to chance, which I don't think helps defend free will at all. Like, even if you say, well, our freedom isn't in like the direct choice between these different options, but it's in like directing our will itself, then, you know, the direction you choose to direct your will in is determined by your character or your will at the time of that choosing. So it just seems like you're pushing the question back.
There are multiple observations you could make given your character. So given all those causal constraints about the system, there is a range because you're finite and your possible substrate universes are infinite. That's how many worlds fits in there. Because you're finite, there's going to be ambiguity as to what exactly you're going to measure. So there is, like, right now, your next moment of measurement, even though it's constrained by your character, physical characteristics and everything, there's a wide range of possible measurements that you could make. You could turn your head to the left and look at this, object on your desk. You'd look to the right.
So right, but which one I make will still be determined by my character at the time.
Not fully determined. No, that's the idea, that it is under.
Yeah, but if you say not fully determined, and you add it seems like you're just introducing an element of indeterminacy, which is basically just an element of chance. So that's still something I don't control.
Well, you control, like, this is where the idea of a query outside of time is what determines the particular act of measurement in time. That's just like Schopenhauer's, like, claiming that we are responsible for our character because we will to be who we are. And that will to be what we are is not a particular act of will in time. It is will beneath time inserting itself into time. It's not also an element of chance, because all of the possible timelines where all of the possible measurement events occur already exist. It's just that relative to your position right now, you have equal access to a number of different succeeding possible states, but all of them already exist. And so no actual randomness is occurring because nothing's coming in and out of being. All of the possible paths are determined, but which one you actually experience is always up to your will from a query made outside of time, to use Henry Stapp's language.
All right, but I still don't see how at the moment of decision of the will that isn't just an expression of my character at the time. Either it's that or it's something not related to my character, in which case it's just kind of indeterminate, or it's not really a choice at all.
I think that's a false dichotomy. So it's not either fully determined by character or not determined by character. It's that your character determines the range of possible measurements that you have access to. And then that within that range, which is determined by your character, you have actual free will to select where your attention goes.
But you'll select where to place your attention based on how you are at the time, based on your character at the time, which you didn't choose.
No, I'm saying it's not fully determined. The character determines what you can do up to a point. But because your character is not infinite and the possible universes are, it does not fully determine which measurement you will make. It's similar to like, a given position on the chessboard does not fully determine what the next move will be. It determines it somewhat. If you have a given position, you can't just move any piece any way. There is determination that happens, but it's not. The next move is not completely determined by the previous move.
But you're saying if we can get outside determinism, then that rescues free will. But I'm saying whether it's determined or not determined, you still wouldn't have decided your character up to that point. So there still isn't free will in the sense of being able to ascribe.
You would
not
have
in the
decided.
sense of being able to ascribe moral responsibility. I don't think so.
Well, this state where we have an observer with many possible measurements it could make that is somewhat constrained up to that time, all you have to do is repeat that instance millions, trillions of times in the past, and you've built up your character to be what it is. So with every measurement, we somewhat change our configuration.
But each individual choice that's shaping your character is also determined by your character at the time.
It's underdetermined by your character. So it's not fully determined. There's a difference between something being completely determined and something being underdetermined. So at every particular moment of choice, your character underdetermines the choice that you have access to. And so that freedom completes, it narrows down into one particular timeline. Because again, the problem is you have finite characteristics, and infinitely many paths open to you in a way. So that finite character constrains the paths, but it can't completely specify it because there's not enough information in our character to completely specify what our next measurement will be. And so there is this range of options at every point. And if you just extrapolate that back in time, you have built up your character and will continue building your character based on the acts of observation that you choose to engage in.
Yeah, but no matter how far back you go, each individual instance of choice is based on how you are at the time, which you did not determine. So even if over the course of time, your, quote unquote decision shapes your character, so you could say that you're transforming your character in a direction, which is freedom. I don't think that solves the problem, because those first decisions that kind of set that ball rolling, you based off of how you were at the time, your character at the time.
But never fully based off of that character at the time. And also, we're dealing with.
Well, it seems like the only other element you can add is basically just adding an element of indeterminism, but I don't think that rescues choice.
Okay, it seems like we're not completely seeing this in the same way. I'm happy to just kind of leave that point where it lies.
Yeah, I mean this is tangential anyway. But actually, there was something else I was going to bring up about that. I was just going to ask, so if someone is arguing the mathematical universe hypothesis, and they use this kind of argument on the basis of parsimony, that, well, what does this element of being add to the maths, the physics itself? Is there not the same objection to you bringing souls into this? I mean, doesn't the system work quite fine by itself, just with integrated information theory and block universes? Wouldn't the system be a lot simpler without these extra agents you're adding?
No, I think the integrated information systems are the souls that I'm talking about. So I'm not adding an extra thing. I'm just calling an integrated information system a soul because that's the Platonic language that is the easiest.
But doesn't the block universe seems to imply absolute determinism, no?
I argue no, because if you have an infinite block universe, any finite configuration will instantiate many times. I've admitted, this is something that I've innovated. I've never heard anyone else make this argument in philosophy. And the argument is that because a finite configuration iterates infinitely many times in an infinite field, you as a finite identity don't exist fully determined in a particular context. There is causal ambiguity as to what particular context you actually exist in. This is why I think superposition is even a thing in the first place. People could, if they want to, watch my perennialist interpretation of quantum mechanics video where I spelled this out. The audio quality is bad. I really need to remake it, but that's how I make sense of quantum mechanics. So integrated information theory itself doesn't offer anything in the way of explaining why superposition exists. I know there are quantum mechanical versions of IIT being developed. I haven't seen any of those papers or anything. I've only read like the original paper. But I don't think I'm adding anything extra except for this principle that a finite configuration will exist in a superposition of possible context, because it, as a finite thing, does not fully determine what precise context it's in, because there are many iterations in an infinite block time.
All right. I think
sense?
I have sort of intuitive objections to that, but it's not totally relevant to the fine-tuning aspect. So I'll just bring up another thing. So I made this argument, again, I borrowed this from Robin Collins, that we should prefer a hypothesis that we have independent evidence, which is natural extrapolation from, the mathematical universe hypothesis. And you said mathematical entities do have verified causal powers. But the example you used was, you said math has the ability to bestow form, like in the case of architects. But that doesn't seem to satisfy it for me. I mean, yeah, of course we know that people base predictions and design and action on maths, but it's not the mathematical object itself there that has the causal power. It's the architect. He's using the math as kind of a language on the basis for him to do his work. So math has the ability to bestow form, or it's a description of form, but we've never witnessed an abstract object exert causal power in the world, right?
Well, if it didn't exert causal power in the world, then the architect couldn't do what he's doing. Like, the architect, it's not purely up to him how he builds the structure. There are geometrical proportions he has to look to, and those mathematical objects somehow do definitely enter into history and affect the architect's behavior, because the architect can look to math, Therefore, the mathematical entities have causal powers because they affect the architect's behavior.
Yeah, that doesn't seem a satisfying answer, but it's hard to quite put my finger on what the problem is.
Well, if mathematical entities don't have causal powers, then we might as well be nominalists. And then what's the status of math? And then that opens up this whole other realm of problems of like how to explain the existence of mathematically perfect, infinitely specifiable things.
Math could exist and it could be real, and it could be a perfect description of the physical world. It could be the language of reality, but that still doesn't necessitate that abstract objects have causal power.
Well, if they didn't have causal power, they couldn't influence behavior. And abstract objects obviously do exert an influence on behavior.
All right, but there's still an element of someone adding something to the maths. Like we say, verified causal powers. I mean, the math is never going to construct the bridge by itself. Like the engineer looks to maths and then reorganizes the physical world on the basis of that. But the math doesn't have causal power. Yeah, I guess it depends how you define causal power. Because in this case, we're talking about the creation of universes, right? So the actual creation of the physical, that seems like a different kind of causation than existent physical things being causally influenced by maths, and that they look to it and then it influences their behavior on the world.
Yes. It is different. It's an extrapolation out of the known causal powers.
But I don't see how that follows at all.
The argument that Tegmark gives is that we use math to describe reality and also to prescribe reality. So both in theoretical mathematics and engineering and applied mathematics. So it has this power to comprehend, explain, and diagram. It acts as a paradigmatic cause. So if we accept that a paradigm has some influence over its image, if that is a genuine type of causation, then we've demonstrated it has causal powers. And Tegmark, using parsimony, says that, well, there's nothing additional outside of the mathematics that provides extra explanatory power here. There's nothing besides the math that's doing the work in explaining this stuff. And so that's the move. That's the logical move. Math has causal powers in description for us and in prescription. And then he says, now, when we look at physical systems and find that we can describe them very well with pure mathematics, where is the justification for ascribing anything else than pure mathematics to the physical systems? So that's the logical step. That's the extrapolation itself.
Right. But I'm saying we can see maths as an excellent description of reality, but we haven't observed it having that kind of direct, creative, causal power. It's only indirect in the sense of someone, it influencing someone's behavior, someone's thought. It's a bit like saying, there's no difference between language and, someone speaking a language, or that the language itself is the cause of them speaking that, right? Whereas if you're looking at like competing theories and you're putting this up against the argument from design, then it seems to be much less of a stretch to say that a mind would have causal power than an abstract object or collection of abstract objects.
Right. Well, then how are you going to define a mind in that case? Like integrated information theory offers a very specific definition of mind, and there's no superior one on offer. So even if you want to say a mind is responsible, again, you're going to point to the causal powers afforded by mathematics. Because even when it comes to the mind, the best description we currently have available is pure mathematics. And so what on top of that mathematics is going to be there to make it mind? Which means, okay, you could come up with a new theory of mind, of the divine mind, since you have to explain that for the intelligent designer hypothesis. But I think what you said is a kind of question begging, because you said we don't see mathematical objects exert this kind of direct causal power. But with the mathematical universe hypothesis, we are saying that everything we observe is the direct action of mathematical systems. And
how is that?
That's a question big.
How is that not just begging the question, though? What
Well,
you just said? Because I said, well, if mathematical universe hypothesis is true, we'd have to have an example of maths having causal power, and then you say, well, mathematical universe hypothesis being true shows that math has causal power.
That would be a kind of circular reasoning. I think specifically making the claim that we don't see math have causal power is rejecting the very thing that's at issue, right? So I'm not claiming that, in fact, I mean, obviously, overall, I am making that claim.
Well, I'm putting that as the challenge, but I don't see what's the counter evidence, apart from just accepting the entire theory. But it seems like before we'd have to accept the entire theory, we'd have to have some example of math having causal power.
Okay, well then what is it? I'll just go with like Tegmark's line. What is it besides math that does have causal power? What is it?
Well, I mean, I guess you'd have to go back to the start of creation. You'd have to, at that point, you'd be asking a question about contingency and necessity, and then we'd be on to the theological aspect, wouldn't we?
Yeah, if you're going to push it back that far, like if we can't find any more proximate, what's Collins' language, independent evidence of verified causal powers of known entities, like my challenge is Tegmark's account gives an explanation of what those causal powers that we actually observe in the cosmos are. So if you want to say that it's not mathematical entities that are those causal powers, then it's left to you to provide an alternative. Like what are the causal powers? If you want to take it all the way back up to God, we can go there too. But then I would say that
well, I think in the case of Collins, he'd use the example of a being like ourselves can design something complex like a Swiss watch, and so we see how complexity can be a product of design. That's an entity with verified causal powers. So I guess he would go from extrapolation to an ultimate entity. I think he's more of a theistic personalist, so I probably wouldn't exactly agree with his conception of God. But
right, okay. So I mean, that seems to be where it's headed then. In the terms that you gave, Robin Collins' objection, I think, doesn't particularly impact the mathematical universe hypothesis in a devastating way, because a plausible case can be made that it's precisely mathematical objects that do have verified causal powers. And if the only other thing you can point to is a mind, well, then it's up to you to define what that mind is. Now, I mean, we can point to, Tegmark can point to IIT, integrated information theory, which says that the mind is a mathematical structure. So once again, like, math is vindicated as having causal powers in that case. But we should look at the theological questions here. And I think the first one that was relevant is my claim that God's omniscience of possible universes entails their actual existence. So my basic argument using divine simplicity is that if God's act of omniscience is God's act of creation, then there can't be any internal distinctions between God's creation and God's omniscience. Ex hypothesi from divine simplicity, they have to be the same. First of all, would you agree with that? Because I think that addresses the contention that you gave about, like, well, we can imagine unreal things. That doesn't necessarily mean they exist. Why can't God imagine unreal stuff and then choose to create certain things? Well, the reason is divine simplicity. God's omniscience is his act of creation. So do you think that
you said earlier that God would be like beyond all creation, but if what you're saying here, that God, just for it even being possible for him to imagine a world that exists of necessity, and it's also like an extension of God, it's part of God, then how is God beyond creation? Creation is just like, it's almost like a body part of God, like it exists of necessity.
Right. That would be the difference. That would be the difference between pantheism, which is the position you're saying where the stuff is just a part of God, and panentheism, where stuff is a part of God, but also the whole of God completely transcends any particular physical limited structure. Like, the God does have an essence beyond the universe as perspectival being. I think the best way to think about this is through perspectives.
Right, but it seems hard to separate his essence if you're saying that these universes exist as a part of God necessarily. Like, there's no God without these universes, because just that he can conceive of them means that they exist eternally.
Right. What is the problem you're saying?
Well, how then can you say that God is, how does God have an essence beyond these universes? They just seem to be an extension of God.
Right, because a universe only exists as a universe, as a cosmos, if a perspective is taken. And that means there's an act of will that puts in a query about measurement and then defines the state of the system. The systems don't exist independent of that act of will to perceive them, right? So the perspectives are all contingent on particular acts of will. But God also has his entire will, right? Which is fundamentally simple, one in itself, perfect, enjoying perfect bliss for eternity. So that's God in his exempt, transcendent aspect, beyond all perspective. This is where we would have to go into the Provatio Boni and argument from the problem of evil, because there are limited goods that we enjoy that God in his eternity could not enjoy, like changing from a state of ignorance to a state of knowledge, because that is a kind of good. God, in order to have not only that perfect transcendent goodness, but also the mundane and limited goodnesses that individual perspectives have, he would have to undergo kind of simultaneously infinitely many thought experiments, let's say, of the way in which he could unfold himself into every possible variety, which necessarily is going to adhere to mathematical regularity, which I think kind of emanates from God's simplicity by necessity, the teleological principle, because God's simplicity is also his will, also his goodness, and then this idea of like computation, or the work done in the acts of measurement. That third element that I mentioned in my last video, I'm not as like insistent on. But anyway, the idea is that God's exempt nature is God when he doesn't take a perspective. We're talking about things that are beyond time, and our language is bound up with time. And also, like, these, I don't know that we can, well, in fact, I'm pretty sure that we can't completely conceptualize this stuff so that it works out. I think when you get to the bottom of any system, ultimately you're going to reach antinomy and seeming paradox, but the idea is that his exempt nature is beyond perspective, and then all of the perspectives are emanated out of God. So that each perspective is a part of God, you would say, but God also has his nature beyond the part-whole relation.
Yeah, again, it seems like a very constrained definition of God, though, that he has to necessarily have all possible states of existence in existence for all times. I mean, at that point.
Well, my contention is that divine simplicity necessitates it ultimately, because his creation is the same as his omniscience. So either God's omniscience is limited, and so is his creation, or both are unlimited, which is what I maintain. That's why I go for the multiverse. But basically, I think you have to reject divine simplicity if you want to maintain this special status of certain created things versus possible worlds that God chooses not to create.
Yeah, so I think the kind of Thomist, like classical theist response would be that's not that all of God's properties are identical and as necessary as he is, but all of his real properties are, and that he has what philosophers would call Cambridge properties, that he can exert a Cambridge relation on the world, where from the perspective of the world, God is as necessary, but God doesn't undergo any change in creating the world. Like the world doesn't reflect causal powers back on God, like a Cambridge relation. Like if someone grows 4 inches taller and then they're taller than me, like I haven't changed, but my relation to them has changed. So yeah, what do you think of that kind of Thomist defense of divine simplicity and creation?
Well, I don't exactly, I mean, that mirrors in a way the essence energy distinction in Palamite orthodoxy. So it seems to be doing the same thing in explanatory terms. I don't quite understand it, what the Cambridge property precisely is and why we should believe that God has these additional properties.
Right. Well, maybe another issue is that language is really only used analogically when it comes to classical theism and apathetic theology. Like there's a likeness between God's intellect and ours, but they're not the same.
Mhm.
So it seems like you're confusing classical theism with personalism when you kind of build up from individual minds and then try and impose that on God.
I'm not entirely following. So maybe we could just try to hit that same question one more time. So my contention is that absolute divine simplicity would mean that God's act of creation is his act of omniscience. Now you introduced this idea of Cambridge properties where God has some additional things that are not quite the same as his other divinely simple properties. And I'm just ignorant of that. And I understand that Thomists must have a response to this objection. Jay Dyer has made this objection. I think it's like a really simple, obvious objection to Thomism that like, okay, doesn't this just lead to like pure monism? Doesn't this lead to Advaita Vedanta? But you're saying that if you introduce this different kind of property that God has, then you can avoid it. And I'm just not quite grasping how that move works.
I think this is Edward Feser's defense of like creation alongside Thomism, that God would have a Cambridge relation to creation, whereas then creation actually has like a real necessary relation to God. So it's like a unilaterally real relation of creation to God. And that would explain how creation can be viewed as radically contingent, even while God's essence is still absolutely metaphysically necessary. God is fully actual in himself, and he doesn't depend on creation in any way, but his act of creation can be viewed as metaphysically necessary because that act of creation is identical with his essence. But the act of creation is contingent insofar as it's identified with the object.
Yeah, so basically, in the relation between world and God, from the world's perspective, God is real. From God's perspective,
Right.
the world is not fully real.
Yeah, and this kind of corresponds to like the idea of God's simultaneous transcendence and immanence in
Yeah,
creation in classical
and
theism.
I get to the same point, and I think any Advaita Vedantist would have to get to the same point where creation is unreal in a sense. That's the idea of Maya. So whenever God takes on one of these perspectives and engages in his act of creation, he gives rise to something that's not quite real because of the limitations imposed on it. Like the question is, what makes a perspective a perspective? It's not the positive content in the perspective that makes it a perspective qua a perspective. It's the limitations that make it a perspective qua perspective. And so the imposition of temporary limitations, the illusion of separation, gives rise to the appearance of the world, but the world as an independent thing is never completely separate. But still, I think if his act of creation itself is one with his essence, then it's going to have to be one with his omniscience. I'm not seeing where God has a separate capacity for like idealizing and contemplating possible worlds versus his taking on of perspective and engaging in the world illusion and descending into infinite possible lives to test things out. Like, I don't see the justification for that distinction in God.
I think maybe it confuses it a bit to talk about possible worlds and the way we talk about fine tuning, because if we're talking about like, well, why did God choose these constants? I mean, okay, so first of all, we're making the argument from fine tuning, and we are observing that these constants seem to be especially fine-tuned. But then if we sort of reason back to creation by God, we're not actually then saying that God is choosing from like an array of possible worlds. Like all universals would be part of God's self-knowledge, and instantiated universals would be their imitation. I think that's like the Tomist view, if I understand correctly. So God wouldn't be like subservient to abstract objects in the sense of like he's a demiurge choosing between. It's not like God is literally like fine-tuning the constants. It appears fine-tuned to us after the fact of creation, because the fact that it's an emanation by God meant that it was a universe capable of.
I still don't understand, the necessity in that, like with the multiverse explanation for fine-tuning. It is necessarily the case. If all of the possible values of the constants are instantiated, there will be life habitable universes out there. That's of necessity. But why is it of necessity that why does God's act of creation lead to a quasi-real world with these particular physical constants? It seems like there's a lot of gaps and a lot of explanations still to do to actually make that work, to explain away fine-tuning.
Well, then you're just asking why did God create this world and not some other world? But
Well,
I'm
yeah.
not sure we could answer that.
Okay. Well, I mean, then it seems like a less satisfying explanation than the multiverse explanation, because we don't have a reason for why God creates one particular world. And I think this.
But I think there has to be an apathetic element to talking about God, don't you think? I mean, if we could pin God down as a mind that could be explained with a definition and integrated information theory, and we could also know his precise reason for creating the world exactly the way it is versus other possible worlds. I mean, it feels like we're trying to constrain God too much here, I think.
Yeah, well, I will say I'm not defining God in terms of IIT. There are minds, souls that adhere to IIT principles in my current best theory that I subscribe to of minds. And then above that, there are eternal minds. They would have to operate on alternative principles to IIT. And then God, being pure unity, would have to be, as you say, beyond description, purely unthinkable. So when I'm talking about the possible worlds that could unfold, I'm talking about a capacity that I recognize in my own soul, right? Because in my view, which is the monist view, Atman is Brahman, the core of myself is at the same time that transcendent aspect of God, where all of it is brought into one together at the same time. And because I have the ability to navigate the different worlds and choose my path as I go, I can extrapolate that ability kind of just ad infinitum and make sense of it. Doesn't prove the existence of those other worlds, but it gives me a rational grounding for conceiving of the nature of possible creations. I mean, that would be the reason why I could pretend to know, what God would be doing, because in my hypothesis about the nature of God, I'm saying God descends and makes himself man, as well as every other creature, in order to gain all the good and all the knowledge and all the, whatever he finds in taking on those limited forms. And so that would be the reason for creation. and I have a justification for claiming to know that because, that is in my being according to my own hypothesis. You could reject that, but then it seems like we're no longer dealing with monism. We'd have to separate ourselves from Advaita Vedanta. Brahman is no longer Atman. And like now we're going to have to define a new position and how exactly that works. Now, going back to why does God make this particular world and not another? If we don't have an explanation for that, then I would say we don't have a really good explanation for fine tuning. Like if our conception of theology is inherently limited in its explanatory power for theological reasons, apatheticism, whatever, then that kind of eliminates the power of that explanation versus the multiverse explanation for fine tuning, because we can only just kind of vaguely gesture to God instead of actually explaining how it happens.
We could probably conclude that God wouldn't create a dead world, right? Like a universe that exists for 4 seconds and doesn't produce any life. I mean, it seems like, in the case of us, we have religious experiences. We have the micro mirrors the macro. We have religion, we have intellect. It seems like intuitively, it seems that that's more like the kind of universe a God would create than a dead universe.
Well, yeah, I agree. But there's also infinitely many timelines that we can easily imagine just as offshoots.
I don't see how that's a problem. I mean, it also seems just unnecessary to say like, well, why did God create the universe this way versus one where a day on Earth is 22 hours instead of 24? Like, I mean, I don't think your explanation needs to be that exhaustive that you can literally know the exact reasons for this specific universe.
But the point at issue between us that we're talking about is whether there are multiple timelines and multiple worlds or not. So like what's your justification in saying that God creates just one world, one timeline rather than many? And I think last I want to get into this objection.
Well, I think so. I'd say I'm not saying it's impossible that there's many worlds. One point you made that if the existence of one world is a good thing, then why not multiple worlds? So yeah, we could. I'd say it's definitely possible that there's multiple worlds. But what I'm objecting to is using multiverse, like every possible world, as an explanation for fine tuning. Because if you have God, I just don't think you need that any longer as an explanation for fine tuning. And then it creates all these problems that if you believe in God and also every possible universe, like what does that do for the problem of evil? You have every possible hell world. I know you have your own objections to this, but it also seems like a great constraint on God. I mean, at that point, God isn't anything. It doesn't seem to me like worthy of reverence. If it's this very sort of abstract Pythagorean thing where all possible states of evil, all possible hell worlds exist literally as an extension of God, it almost seems to lose the transcendent apophatic aspect.
Right. Well, I will just say the many worlds for me doesn't like conflict with theological notions that I know. It simplifies and fills out the picture in my own views on theology. And so now we'll deal with this issue of the problem of evil. So if you believe in God, then you're going to have to deal with the problem of evil at some point, because clearly there is suffering in the world. God didn't create a perfect paradise. I mean, maybe if you believe in the Genesis account, he did, and then we messed it up. But he also like created us knowing that we would lead to our own fall. So
actually, but before you get on to that, because I'm going to forget this point otherwise, but
okay.
I just want to say as well, it seemed like you have this binary between like personal theism and like Advaita or perennialism at the other end, but I really don't see it like that. I mean, like a lot of the popularizers of perennialism, like the traditionalist school, very much saw classical theist metaphysics as like the purest expression of perennialism. And I don't see actually a huge difference between someone like Shankara, who would be a non-dualist, you'd probably consider him like a panentheist, and someone like Ibn Arabi, he's a Sufi, he's a mystic, but his philosophy would be considered more like classical theism. But also, I don't see why. I mean, you seem to think that it entails in Advaita Vedanta that a multiverse follows, but I mean, in Advaita they do talk about creation ex nihilo, and that the world is an emanation of God, and they often talk about it as a single world. They don't invoke that all possible emanations of God exist. So wouldn't you just have the same problem with Advaita?
But they do I mean, I think they do, because it's as described in the myths, like creation is not in time for most Hindus. Creation is eternal and cyclic. So creation goes through many different iterations, not just cycles on Earth on this one planet, but also in different iterations of the universe as a whole. Like Roger Penrose has this idea of the cyclic universe. I mean, Hindus have a very similar idea. Brahma is the creator god, is supposed to open his eyes and like give rise to a whole universe cycle, and then close his eyes, and he does that like either an infinite number of times, or they came up with some really big number to say how many times he does it. I've always seen Hindu mythology as reflective of multiverse cosmology. I think it's an entailment. If you take divine simplicity and say that God's omniscience is the same as God's creation, then you're going to have everything in God's knowledge necessarily in God's creation as well. I know it's not like an absolute ubiquitous position that non-dualism automatically leads to a multiverse. I just don't understand how the narrowing process, I've never seen anyone explain how the narrowing process works so that some comprehensible, intelligible, teleologically consistent timelines, creations are rejected. By whom are they rejected? And it was, presumably by God, but then how? If we don't have an explanation for why God does certain things and not others, creates certain things and not others, to me, it's like we're just using a word, God, to fill in a blank for an explanation when we don't really have one.
I think the way you talk about possible worlds and God is kind of constraining God. Like possible worlds aren't actual. Like it seems like the problem with possible world arguments is like when theists use them, like they purport to show God's necessary existence in all of them, but they're basically saying that God's necessity in each of them is dependent on something other than God himself. When we're talking about fine-tuning or why the universe is fine-tuned, we can sort of use that to go back to an argument for God. But when you're talking about the nature of God, to actually talk about him choosing between possibilities and like excluding possibilities, I just think that's the wrong kind of language.
Well, I do too. That's why it doesn't make sense to me. And if you don't use that kind of language, how do you account for his creation narrowing down to just one thing?
You could argue that possible worlds aren't actually a possible state of existence which create a separation in God. Instead, they're like the diverse ways in which divine essence might be imitated. But I think it's a problem of our mind trying to impose this way of looking at it where God is literally like choosing between possible worlds.
Right, which I think doesn't make sense. That kind of like what I said, I think in my original response is that those sorts of modal distinctions don't make sense with regard to an ultimate being. Yeah,
I agree, but I don't think it follows then that all the possible worlds exist.
Well, if there's no difference between possible and actual for God, if there's no difference for God between possible and actual, then all possible worlds would have to exist. What you would have to do is to say, like you just said, that the possible worlds are the actual worlds, but actually possibility is much more highly constrained than we understand.
It still seems like you're kind of making God subservient to abstract objects or to possibility. I mean, again, it just seems like maybe it's a limitation in our way of thinking, but I don't know.
Well, yeah. Again, going back to this like Advaita Vedanta concept, I know my talk of theology often outstrips bounds that people would want to place on theologizing, but like my view is that Atman is Brahman. So I believe that the thing at the core of my being is the same as the thing that we're trying to describe right now. And so I might not, because I'm always kind of trapped in my own states of will that are focused on particulars, I don't know the nature, I don't have like human knowledge of that ground, but it is in my being, in a manner of speaking. And so I think that justifies a certain level of talking about it, and also then mystic experience. Like the more you've had it, the more you've gone through philosophical paths also, the more you can kind of be justified in making these sorts of claims about God. Now, if we want to say like that's constraining God, because God is not going to operate according to these logical distinctions, whatever, then what is the alternative? What's the alternative theology? Like either you're going to go full nominalism and say that God's will is supreme and our thought about what his nature may be by natural theology is strictly impossible. And then like, okay, we're Protestants and we'll just like fully go into revealed theology because it's the only source of grounding. Or like we take the classical theist move of saying that God's essence like is at the same time the logos structuring principles of the world, and so that's why everything he does adheres to logic, and that's why we can like talk about God in logical terms and it still makes sense. I don't see that as a problem. It's not that God's subservient to logical principles or whatever, it's that God is those principles.
Yeah, I feel like there might be a problem in talk of possible worlds in the first place. Like it's presupposing that the world is an entity that can be thought about prior to creation. I think a Thomist would probably deny that God selects the world and that the priority of act to potency, to use like Thomist language, means that it had actually been mistaken to speak of possible essences or possible worlds which are prior to the act of creation. Yeah, so there's no potencies that pre-exist being or SE itself. But I guess, yeah, that would go back to your other objection that there'd have to be a distinction in his knowledge, right?
Yeah, if you want to maintain the idea that they are possible and not actual. I'm saying there is no difference between possibility and actuality for God. There is no modal distinction there. And so from that follows the multiverse. God, if he's able to have knowledge of quote unquote possible worlds, what their laws might be, what every last event within each of those timelines of those worlds would be, if his omniscience is that powerful and he really does see everything we could contemplate as a possibility, and obviously go way beyond that. And there is no real distinction in God between possibility and actuality, because God is pure act, then all of his acts of contemplation are joined to his acts of creation, and we have the multiverse.
What if the Thomas said that act is prior to potency, and so God's causality is totally unlike our own?
Well, I would have no problem with that. Although I would say it can't be totally unlike our own, because I'm not a dualist when it comes to the essence of the soul. I think the essence of the soul is God at the end of the day. So
I mean, it doesn't seem a problem to me intuitively that God could, out of absolute freedom, emanate a world rather than be kind of constrained to this like block existence where every possible form of existence exists at all time, changelessly. I mean, the first picture of God there seems much more intuitively satisfying than the other one.
Because I think it gives the freedom of God the emphasis, but it's a freedom that we have no access to in terms of explanation. So it's satisfying because it gives us a picture of God that maps onto the picture of virtue we have with regard to people. Because I mean, our idea that freedom is a good thing is derived from our interpersonal interactions. When someone has control over themselves, they have like, positive liberty, that's a good thing. When they have the ability to make decisions and affect change, they have power, freedom is a good thing. I think that's the reason that picture is intuitively satisfying, because it makes God into an object that like is more worthy of worship to us according to our conventional notions. But I don't think that's even true, because I think the kind of freedom that God has is bound up with necessity. I don't think there's a distinction in God between free action and necessitated action. I think God is kind of pure act and pure necessity, so that if he contemplates all possible worlds, creates all possible worlds, it's not like he's consigned to do that any more than he would be consigned in the case of a single world. Is there necessity in God and freedom in God as distinct characteristics? And if that's so, what is the nature of God's freedom? Like it seems to be introducing a concept, a distinction in God between God's freedom and God's necessity that remains to me qualified, and it just doesn't make sense to me in the holistic view.
Just to recap, so I mean, your issue isn't that this would require some change in God, and that there'd be a state where God hasn't created a universe, and then there's a state where God has created a universe. So you accept that like contingent creation can be like an eternal act of, well, I won't say liberty or freedom because I don't think you accept that aspect, but it can be an eternal act from God's perspective. Your issue is in the distinction in knowledge in God, in that he would have knowledge of every possible world, but then there's one particular world that's different for some reason from all of these. So that would have had to have involved some kind of choice, which would sort of temporalize God. Is that basically?
Well, we don't have to use the concept of choice, and it's not necessarily that it temporalizes God. It's just that there is then a distinction in God, where his omniscience has certain attributes, and his creation, his act of creation, has different attributes, and we're just left like wondering as to what the nature of that distinction is. It just seems ill-defined. So it's introducing a distinction without an adequate explanation to make it a useful distinction.
I'm not sure if I could give an exact systematic answer to that. I guess personally, I'm kind of comfortable having like an apathetic element to that, where I do base a lot of my beliefs about God on mysticism and mystical theology, and there being an aspect of the unexplained, of the why or how of creation of this particular universe. I guess I'm kind of comfortable with that being the gap in the system.
Sure, but like without a justification for why that gap regarding like the single universe idea specifically, why that's an acceptable gap versus anybody offering an alternative theory, like the multiverse theorists say, they can then turn around and say like, well, you have a gap in your system that you feel comfortable not explaining. So what if you point to a gap in mine? Like, you know what I mean? It's like if we're doing philosophy, if we're trying to come up with the best explanation and compete against other competing worldviews, then we shouldn't be comfortable just resting in gaps where we don't really understand what's going on there. But
I mean, I have other reasons for accepting that view of God. Like I take an argument from religious experience about the universal content of mysticism. I think that basically the argument from contingency is sound. So, I mean, does the system need to be absolutely complete? Because even in the case of the mathematical universe hypothesis, it's still incomplete in the sense of where did the mathematical objects come from? That system is still missing something simple and composite.
Yeah, you have to tie it into Platonism to complete it. And it, helpfully it does actually tie in really well. Like it's logically consistent. I do just want to like get your take on the problem of evil contention, because this is like the theological argument that I'm happy with. I still don't really know why it is more intuitively satisfying for many people, not just you, to say God creates one world. But the question is like, okay, now how does that work? Is there possibility and actuality coexisting in God, or which we don't like, neither you nor I prefer that solution, or does God make a choice analogous to our choices in time? We don't like that solution. And so we're left with like, we like this idea of a single universe, not exactly sure why we like it and why and how God, comes to create just that one. My view is that God wants to contemplate all contingent possibility, all limited perspectives, all illusory conditions, because illusory conditions have some good. Like I said before, we have some goods that God doesn't have in his absolute transcendent form, because we undergo change for the better. The eternal God doesn't go through any change because he's eternal. So insofar as we can experience some things that are in a way good but not accessible to God, God would benefit himself by going through those, provided that the evil, the suffering, the negative qualities in those perspectives are ultimately negated in terms of absolute existence by privatio boni. So it's only the absence, it's only the kind of temporarily imposed limitations that God puts himself under. But then the positive content of the evil is not real, because evil is not a real substantial thing. It's like a shadow, it's like an absence. And so what you get then is a maximization of the good on net for an act of creation. So for me, that's a very satisfying explanation for the problem of evil. Creation is worth it because there are limited goods that aren't in God that God wants to enjoy, and also to give the benefit of the otherness of his creation, because we're both the same and other than God. We aren't.
Well, when you say that there's states that God wants to enjoy, but then, I mean, aren't you running into the earlier problem of God choosing one possible world?
Well, No,
I
because
mean, not
God,
exactly the same, but God is still choosing something basically on the basis of a privation.
he's choosing to, or he does seek out all goodnesses in general. So that doesn't get us down to like choosing a specific world. Just the calculus is God has, in a way, two choices. And this is an analogical account. It's not like he makes this choice out of eternity, but he has his eternal nature where he has the perfect experience. Now he can say, well, I could leave it at that, or I could simulate for myself what it would be like if I was less perfect than I am, and then like improved myself into a better state. And that effort,
Okay, but
process.
couldn't I use your kind of axiological reasoning there? Couldn't I say that God is infinitely good in himself, but he seeks out states which will maximize goodness, and so he chooses X number of possible worlds, and he doesn't instantiate Y number of possible worlds because they're bad worlds.
Right.
Um,
Exactly. I agree with that. That's my view. It's not just that he creates like
but
every
then that
mathematically
solves,
possible
but
world.
then that
It,
doesn't that solve the objection you were bringing to me a couple of minutes ago about that there's a distinction in God's knowledge.
the solution is what I said that you correctly identified, which is that there isn't a distinction between possible and actual, because the only real possibilities are the ones that are actualized. So, but what we might think of as possible is just a result of our misconception. So we can
Right.
imagine the hell dimensions that God might create of pure suffering and say that's possible, but we're getting it wrong because we don't understand the system that we're actually thinking of. It's like a child
Right,
might
yeah.
think that
I
something
mean,
is
I think this
possible,
is
but he doesn't know
the
what's really
point.
possible.
This is the point I was trying to make earlier, that we can reason back with fine tuning. We can talk about how the cosmological constant could have been different or whatever. But then when we get to God and we try and apply possible worlds to God and we say, why did he choose this over every other that it kind of breaks down at that point, that we're misapplying that sort of vision of possible worlds to God. So it seems like we actually agree on this.
Right. You have to collapse the possible and the actual together. And I think the way to do that and the way to avoid unpalatable creations of God is to join mathematical consistency and teleology into what is possible. The only possible structures are teleologically and mathematically consistent.
Well,
So when
what about axiology? What about
I would join
God?
that into teleology.
Okay. Well, then it seems like we're in almost complete agreement. I mean, well then, okay. So
Except
then it seems like your only issue was that there's no reason to suppose that he would choose one good possible world over a lot of good possible
exactly,
worlds.
because to me that's
Well,
okay.
I don't actually,
I'll give the nature of the
I don't actually
objection.
disagree with that.
Okay, well then, good. I'm glad that happened. But I just want to like say, at every moment there are trillions of possible measurement outcomes that could occur, right? 1 second goes through quadrillions of different possible states of configuration of the room that you're sitting in, and like multiply that, you just get to incredible astronomical figures when you start to think about like the odds of us lining up on this one and only real space-time timeline, right? So if you say that God created one world and there are no branching timelines and it's just one straight shot in time and this is the only outcome, it's like that seems like an extreme narrowing down.
Well,
Something needs to do the work of narrowing that down. So you have mathematical consistency that can narrow it down some, but not enough, because with just that, we would still have a vast multiverse. Teleological principles could narrow it down some, but can those alone narrow it down the trillions and quadrillions of times that you would need to get this knife's edge only possible outcome? That seems unlikely. So how does the narrowing down get that tight? Like I'm comfortable saying
well,
that there are
I think I said,
constraints, but
yeah, I think I said at the start, I don't actually have a problem with the idea of being a theist and believing in many worlds. What I take issue with is believing like all possible worlds, which includes like the hell worlds, and which is basically a substitution for the argument from design, where you're appealing to every possible world to explain creation at all. But if you're saying that God exists and that there's a teleology to creation and that God chooses certain worlds because they're good, and again, this isn't exactly how it is, but we're just
yeah,
speaking
yeah, I get it.
analogically. Yeah, I don't have an issue with that at all, actually. I've been arguing against that, like, every possible world exists that isn't constrained by axiology or teleology. But I wouldn't argue that, like, we can absolutely be sure that God created one world, one good world versus many good worlds. Because I also think I said earlier that your basic argument from the problem of evil, that if one world is good, then many other worlds would also be good for the same reason, that I also accept that. And that is actually, I think, a powerful argument that there would be many worlds.
Okay.
So yeah, what I'm arguing against is more this kind of Pythagorean, like, sort of like block approach to things, where all of these universes exist by mathematical necessity, and there's no element of axiology or teleology coming from God within that. So it seems like we don't actually disagree a whole lot.
No, actually, yeah, we don't disagree that much. I just think the odds are that there should be many worlds, because if the solution to the problem of evil is that God gets to reap all the goodness of finite experience, but then not ultimately suffer the downside, then it seems like you could make a whole bunch of worlds that are going to have some good in them if Privatio Boni eliminates the ultimate evilness of the suffering and all that in the worlds. And then obviously there are other reasons besides fine tuning to think about a multiverse. And like the idea of superposition in the first place, for me, only makes sense if we talk about possible timelines. It only makes sense with some kind of many worlds. And it's not even like within quantum mechanics that I think many worlds is sufficient and itself like a complete interpretation. I don't think there is a complete interpretation of quantum mechanics currently. I think you could combine many worlds with the relational interpretation of Carlo Rovelli and a few other ideas. Like Bohmian mechanics introduces this new entity, like the separate wave function, but how exactly that fits into the picture is unclear. I mean, something like that seems to obtain. Just the nature of the quote unquote pilot wave, I think can be explained within a many worlds context as, in my view, where we are with regard to a superposition of possible contexts, and the evolution of those contexts obeys the Schrodinger equation, moves like a wave, because of the way in which those possibilities are narrowed down as time goes on, as signals propagate, energy propagates, which some of that's complicated, and I am not prepared to talk on it now. But my point is, like, I think that a lot of evidence from physics is simplified if you do buy many worlds. And also, with my account of the problem of evil solution, you would expect God to create many more worlds so that he would have those bits of knowledge. Otherwise, the conclusion would be whatever God doesn't actually create, he doesn't know. From the arguments that we've given so far, what God doesn't choose to create is actually not possible. And then, like, God's omniscience kind of shrinks in a certain regard, and we have to explain why those possible worlds that we can seem to imagine aren't actually possible. And I mean, hey, at the end of the day, if we keep doing that work and explain why things that we thought were possible actually aren't, and we narrow it down to a thin slice, and we are on the knife's edge of the only real possible world, then fine. But it's like there's a lot of work to do to get to that point, and I'd be happy in the meantime buying the idea that God creates all good worlds, all truly possible worlds, not like literally any mathematically possible one. And also, it is interesting that this, what we're talking about here, is the same disagreement that Leibniz had with Descartes. According to Leibniz, in a letter to somebody that I read, Leibniz says Descartes says that any mathematically possible world exists. And that eliminates this kind of axiology, teleology in nature and in God ultimately, and makes God into a kind of machine. And Leibniz wanted to fix that. And so he added this idea, physical things are joined to souls. So it's the same solution that I've been talking about. If real mathematical structures are integrated information systems, then that constrains the way that they can evolve, because teleology does apply to minds. So I think I agree with Leibniz, and I'm glad that I disagree less with you than I thought. And this has been very, I think, productive and interesting. So was there anything else that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, yeah, that was interesting. I mean, so I think basically my certain position was that you don't need to invoke multiverse, because you can say that again, axiology, teleology decides that God chooses certain worlds because they're good. And then I said that I see a mistake in then trying to apply like language of possible worlds to God, that it seems like we're sort of pushing that back too much when we talk about God's mind analogically to ours, but really he isn't actually looking at all these possible worlds and pulling levers. And then you've ended up saying that in a roundabout way, kind of the same thing like that. But you've basically said that though, you basically start from there and say that the bad worlds aren't possible because of axiology, right? So we've kind of ended up in the same place. Is that fair enough?
Yes, yes. There is a kind of tuning. I just would say I want to reject the kind of tuning that I think a lot of theistic personalists think about, which is, yeah, God has infinite knowledge of all possible worlds, and he makes his choice. I think a lot of people do think that's the argument from design for fine tuning. So yeah, we ultimately are agreed there is some tuning because axiology is inherent, teleology is inherent in possibility, and possibility can't be separated from the good. So what is possible is good in some respect, and that narrows it down from like pure mathematical possibility. So that is tuning. But I think, there's a lot of good out there that can be obtained. And so a certain amount of the tuning of our world, I would just chalk up to the anthropic principle. So I think the anthropic principle does some of the work for quote unquote fine tuning, and then axiological necessity being baked into the nature of God and his creation does the rest
So
of the work.
just to clarify this last point, so you're kind of getting around the earlier problem you raised about divine simplicity by saying that the good exists kind of sovereignly, independently, and then that itself kind of constrains the possible worlds that an omniscient God can conceive of. So God actually is conceiving all of the possible worlds, but
Right.
that itself is constrained by the good. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's quite an interesting solution to that little problem we were going back and forth on. Yeah, I can't say I have a problem with that actually.
Well, good. All right. I think there are still some theological issues that I would want to hear more about from classical theists, how they conceive of this problem, and like
Yeah, I mean,
the issue.
I'm not a Thomist or anything. That was one person who I've seen deal with this is Edward Feser. I think his first name is Edward, isn't it? He's like one of the most famous Thomist philosophers. But yeah, his explanation was Cambridge relations and that there are also aspects of God that aren't necessary, which I hadn't actually encountered that explanation from a Thomist before. But that was the way he dealt with objections about creation being a problem for divine simplicity.
Yeah, that issue of necessity versus freedom in God, I think is a little confused still as far as how a Thomist would respond to it. It seems like the Cambridge properties aspect of it basically leads to a Maya doctrine at the end of the day, which I'm comfortable with as well, obviously. So yeah, I would like to hear from others in other words who have theistic views. How do you think fine tuning is resolved? Like I take elements of a multiverse explanation from the anthropic principle, but then I do believe in a certain amount of tuning because I'm not a Cartesian. I don't think literally every mathematically possible thing exists. There are other principles that are baked in from the beginning, like goodness. Goodness is a first principle in Platonism. So yeah, this has been cool. If anybody else wants to give their perspectives on this, feel free to do so in the comments. Keith, you have one reading club going, book club that I'm in right now on Eric Pearl's book, Thinking Being, which is basically like a summation of classical metaphysics, kind of going up through the ancients to Aquinas, and I'm really enjoying it. So I recommend that to people. Is there anything else that you would refer the audience to?
No, I just recommend that. I posted a recording of our Aristotle discussion, which I thought was quite good on YouTube. And yeah, if people want to join that, that'd be great. I do that on Subscribe, Sarah and Gumroad. Yeah, Pearl's book has been really enjoyable. It's really kind of gotten me into some of these classical thinkers. Like his take on Aquinas is much different than any way I've ever thought about Thomism. So I really highly recommend that book as well. it is like $200, but I think people should probably be able to find it online. Not that I would encourage that.
Right. I also have my reading group, the Plato group. You can find information about that on the Patreon. And yeah, this was very fun. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you guys for listening and have a good rest of your day.